For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1997 as amended.
The clerk will report to the title of the bill.
H.R. 1997, a bill to encourage United States-Ukraine cybersecurity cooperation and require a report regarding such cooperation and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I'm going to ask unanimous consent, Speaker, that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include any extraneous material in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
And the gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we're here to talk about Ukraine and the U.S.-Ukraine cyber cooperation. The Ukraine, of course, is on the front lines of digital combat, as we've learned. Few countries have endured as great a level of cyber invasion and aggression as has Ukraine at the hands of Russia and at the hands of other malicious actors as well. I led a delegation of 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans into the east, into Dnipropetrovsk, into the Donbass region. And we had an opportunity to hear about what is being done to try to tear that country apart. This is in addition to the invasion in the east, the occupation of the east. This is the farthest east one can go in Ukraine today, and you can see the struggle that everyday people are having with the disinformation campaign launched against them relentlessly. And as President Poroshenko stated, cyberspace has turned into another battlefield for state independence, and that is so true for Ukraine. And their struggle to defend their independence and their territorial integrity from Russian aggression extends far beyond the armed conflict of the occupation of its territory. In 2014, hackers targeted Ukraine's electoral infrastructure just days before the presidential election. The following year, a malicious cyber intrusion shut down the country's electric grid, turning off the lights, turning off the heat in the dead of winter. Ukraine's critical infrastructure, including its national railway system, its major stock exchanges, its busiest airport, have been repeatedly targeted by sophisticated cyber attacks. And most of these continuing assaults have been identified by experts as Russian in origin. By working with the government in Kyiv, we can better prepare ourselves, as well as our friends and partner countries, against similar aggression, including combating Russian disinformation efforts that rely heavily on disseminating propaganda, and that propaganda poses as legitimate news. So this bill will enhance our cooperation with Ukraine in addressing shared cyber challenges, including cybercrime and the protection of critical infrastructure. Modern society requires an internet worldwide that is open, that is reliable, that is secure, which can only be ensured if all those who seek to preserve it join forces to defeat those who wish to destroy it. So I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank you for bringing up my bipartisan bill, and I especially want to thank our chairman of our committee, Mr. Royce from California, for his action and moving on our bipartisan piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, I believe cybersecurity is the national security challenge of our time. Cyber warfare is inexpensive to carry out and easy for adversaries to hide behind, making it especially damaging, difficult to detect, and impossible for the victim to quickly respond. In January, the CIA attributed to Russian military hackers a cyber attack that crippled computers in Ukraine last year. This attack wiped data from the computers of banks, energy firms, senior government officials, and an airport. The virus went on to affect computer systems in Denmark, India, and even here in the United States. For years, Putin has been using Ukraine as a field test for these cyber attacks. Ukraine, after all, is on the front line for these nation self-directed cyber attacks, and they are potential harbingers of attacks on the United States. By assisting Ukraine, we can learn best practices to best defend ourselves. For these reasons, I introduced H.R. 1997 with my Republican colleague from Pennsylvania, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, which encourages cooperation between the United States and our ally Ukraine on matters of cybersecurity and requires a report from the State Department on best practices to protect ourselves to the benefit of both nations. In Ukraine, it's no coincidence that cyber attacks against itself increased when the Ukrainian people self-organized to demand an open and democratic society in 2014, contrary to Putin's interests. Days before the 2014 presidential election, hackers infiltrated Ukraine's Central Election Commission with a series of attacks that disabled the website in an attempt to sow distrust in the outcome of the election of President Poroshenko. In December 2015, hackers remotely shut down power at 3 regional electricity distribution companies, creating a power outage affecting more than 200,000 people. We can only imagine what it must feel like to lose electricity and heat during the winter in Ukraine. Cyber attacks, unfortunately, have only continued since. Ukraine's next presidential election is just next year. Our own elections are right around the corner, later this year, and of course, presidential election in 2020. So both the United States and Ukraine have clear interests in strengthening our cyber defenses. Moreover, our cooperation toward this goal will send a strong, important signal of Western support for Ukraine at a time when it is literally fighting to protect its own democracy. We must stand strong with the people of Ukraine and our NATO allies and come together in furtherance of our cybersecurity defenses. This bill is a reasonable first step to do just that, and it is obviously very timely. I thank Chairman Royce again, as well as Ranking Member Engel, for their hard work and support for this bill, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it. It is time we address this vital issue. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Brian Fitzpatrick, an esteemed member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and besides Brendan Boyle here, another big Philly Eagles fan.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for all of your work that you do on our committee. Thank you for bringing this bill to the floor. To my colleague, Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania, thank you for all of your work on this piece of legislation. And Mr. Speaker, I rise today to voice my full support for H.R. 1997, the U.S.-Ukraine Cybersecurity Cooperation Act. During my career as an FBI agent, I was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, Ukraine, where I worked closely with our Ukrainian counterparts on a whole host of issues to include cybersecurity. Mr. Speaker, one thing is clear. We must strengthen our relationship with Ukraine wherever possible, in whatever means possible. They have acted as a steadfast ally to the United States against a hostile Russia. Further, there should be no doubt that cybersecurity and cyber warfare are the rising threats of our time. We have seen plenty of occasions where bad actors, state-sponsored or otherwise, have executed cyber attacks against private companies, government entities, and the very institutions upon which our nation was founded. These attacks will only continue to increase, both in sophistication and frequency, as we continue into the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, I strongly urge my colleagues, Democrat and Republican alike, to support this crucial and necessary piece of legislation, both for the United States and the Ukraine and all our allies. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman for California reserve.
I continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, someone who grew up a strong Philadelphia sports fan, Mr. Deutsch.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I thank my friend from the Philadelphia area who has introduced this important piece of legislation with Mr. Fitzpatrick, another fine representative from the Philadelphia sports-loving area, which gives me the opportunity on the House floor to claim my Pennsylvania roots and to congratulate the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay. I rise in support of the U.S.-Ukraine Cybersecurity Cooperation Act introduced by Mr. Boyle and Mr. Fitzpatrick. And I thank Chairman Royce for his leadership, his ongoing leadership on this issue. The director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, said last week that he has every expectation that Russia will again try to meddle in our elections. That should concern us. It should also concern us that the president has decided to ignore Congress and not impose sanctions against Russia. But Russia's attacks on the United States follow a playbook that they've used in their own region, most recently against Ukraine. In addition to rampant disinformation campaigns and political interference, Russia has launched numerous cyber attacks against Ukraine, including knocking out large swaths of its electrical grid in massive attacks. Those capabilities could one day be used against us here at home. That's why the U.S.-Ukraine Cybersecurity Cooperation Act is so important. The United States has an interest both in defending Ukraine from Russian aggression and in securing our own defenses. Helping Ukraine actually teaches us best practices for hardening our own defenses against potential Russian attacks on our critical infrastructure. That's why I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1997, the U.S.-Ukraine Cybersecurity Cooperation Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Gentleman for Pennsylvania Reserve.
Continued reserve, yes.
Gentleman for California is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve. I have no further speakers.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Well, with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to close. And just allow me to say, one thing that strikes me and saddens me when I hold town halls or am meeting with constituent groups, usually some variation of this comment will be made, why don't you guys get along? Why don't you do something? And actually, I then tell them about our work on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I tell them that under the leadership of Ed Royce and Elliot Engel, as well as the other members of the committee from both sides of the aisle, a lot of work does get done, and a real spirit of cooperation prevails in our committee meetings. And I think that this piece of legislation is an example of that. This is an important issue. We are standing up for Ukraine, but as I mentioned earlier, we're also doing what is clearly in the best interest of the United States. So I urge, at the risk of sounding immodest, I urge passage of my legislation, legislation that I've worked on very hard with Brian Fitzpatrick, and with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman for California is recognized.
Yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Well, in closing, I would like to also recognize and thank my colleagues, especially Mr. Boyle and Mr. Fitzpatrick, one Democrat and one Republican, both from Philadelphia, the sponsors of this bipartisan legislation. I want to thank you, Mr. Boyle, for your work on this important bill, because I think the threat to Ukraine in cyberspace is not isolated. It shouldn't be ignored. And I think that when we talk to the researchers, they've warned that the attacks on Ukraine by state and by non-state actors might be a test run, for even larger attacks in the future, on the United States, additional attacks, and on our NATO allies, additional attacks. And while we must bolster our own capabilities, we should also cooperate with our friends and partners such as Ukraine, because we've got to be sharing best practices, we've got to improve joint capabilities, we've got to provide that mutual assistance to prevent and mitigate and respond to those international cyber attacks. This legislation is going to enhance that effort, and in so doing, it's going to strengthen our ability to protect our own country from those who seek to do us harm. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1997 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Yeah. I object.
California.
I object to the vote on the ground that a quorum is not present, and I make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.